This is election year in the United States of America, and despite talk of the relative decline of America, whoever's going to win the presidential election is going to affect your life in many ways, because the United States is still the one global superpower. So to discuss what is already becoming one of the most interesting American elections I've ever known, we have a really interesting panel. We have the writer and author Carol Gould, Dr. Jan Halper-Hayes, who's Vice President of Worldwide Republicans, and Season Butler, an academic author based here in London. I'd like to start by not looking at the election, but looking at the outgoing president, Barack Obama. Back in 2008, the slogan was, "Yes, we can," and there was a sense that this was going to bring fundamental change. Carol, what's your verdict on just how successful Barack Obama has been in office?
Well, he's not been nearly as successful as people had dreamt, had hoped, partly because sort of three-quarters of the way, I'd say 70% of the way through his presidency, he lost both houses of Congress. So first he lost the Congress, then he lost the Senate. To me, that is always a mirror of the electorate not being happy with their president. So the Congress went to the Republicans, and then the Senate went to the Republicans, including a big rise in the new Tea Party movement, which was a right-wing movement that came out of the popularity of Sarah Palin.
So, Jan, I presume you didn't vote for Obama back in 2008, but did you have that sense of excitement?
Well, I definitely had that sense of excitement, and I really had hoped for a great paradigm shift. And instead, you know, he promised to have a nation of compromise. He promised to have peace in the Middle East, and he promised that he would not raise the debt. Well, he's increased the debt by 160%. We definitely do not have peace in the Middle East, and he is going to go down as the most divisive president. And I think the only ones who could be proud of him are Iran, Cuba, Assad, ISIS, cop shooters.
That's some list. Season, what were your hopes then for Barack Obama, and how have they turned out?
My hopes for the Obama presidency were measured because I think that Western politics has become heavily corporatized, and I'm skeptical as to what the executive can actually do to forward a progressive agenda. I think it's worth bearing in mind as well that we did have a congressional majority leader in 2010 who said, our primary goal at the moment is to undermine Obama's presidency and to keep him from achieving things like universal health care and some of the major reforms that would have made the presidency the kind of paradigm shift that everyone had hoped for.
Well, let's just start with foreign policy, because there was a lot of hope that fundamental change. I mean, one of the promises was Guantanamo was going to be closed, and it's still there. I mean, how do you think he's fared in his foreign policy?
I think that people will look to Obama, some observers from around the world, well, hooray, he tracked down Osama bin Laden, and he got rid of Osama bin Laden, but that hasn't stopped terrorism. You could look at it the other side of the coin, which is since the death of bin Laden, ISIS has risen up. Obama has not engaged, as I thought he would, with the Israel-Palestinian issue, not nearly as much as I thought he would. He's standing back from engaging. This has been for 8 years now. He stood back from engaging in Syria, much to the dismay of senators like John McCain, okay, Republican, but there were several Democrats who felt that President Obama should have engaged much more with that situation. And with the general situation in the Middle East, we had the Arab Spring and so many conflicts. And so I think people will say that Obama was almost ineffectual in that region. Certainly I, as an observer, as a commentator, am disappointed most with the issue of the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Jan, as we talk, Obama's just been in Cuba. I mean, that's one triumph for him, isn't it?
I actually think that Obama's legacy shopping right now, and he's going to hope that Cuba might go down as a positive trip. I mean, he was promising us things in Iran, but instead what happened in Iran is we had in the elections the hardliners, and they did everything to disqualify any of the moderates. When it came to his immigration bill, 39 Democrats defected and joined the Republicans in voting to defeat it. TTP, that was defeated. There isn't anything really that Obama can claim as a success within his foreign policy.
That's a fairly scathing indictment. Do you buy into that, Season?
I think I don't really have much to counter here. I mean, I think that the sort of geopolitical situation that he inherited was a complete catastrophe. And although I would say that thawing relations between Iran and the U.S. and actually making those diplomatic ties is something that will go down as a positive thing that's happened in the region and could end up being beneficial in terms of the Israeli position in the rest of the region.
Well, can I just ask you on domestic policy, do you think he's got anything to brag about when he finally leaves office?
20 million Americans with health care who didn't have health care before. Also reducing the burden of student loan debt for millions of graduates, I think, is significant.
Jan, would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't, because yes, I think the part of Obamacare that was successful is that any pre-existing condition to disqualify you from insurance was taken away, and that was really needed. But we have 330 million people in America. So now, this year, only 12.7 million signed up for Obamacare, and it's because the costs have become so prohibitive. His executive orders have turned people off. He has lowered the esteem of America around the globe. The military, he really doesn't, he's not fond of the military, so he's made sure that at least 15 of the most senior people have been forced to retire. And I think that Black Lives Matter is an outgrowth of some of the anger at Obama, because you would have thought of anything he would have taken care of his own people. And instead, he has been so much part of inciting and infusing what is going on. And we look at the unemployment rate for Black Americans when he first came in, and now, you know, it's gone up 7 percentage points.
I mean, that's an important... Carol, I'll bring you in a minute, but Susan, I have to ask you that. I mean, there must have been hope. There's the first black president. He was going to bring about some fundamental change.
I think, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again, that real social change doesn't happen from the top down. The prison-industrial complex was there. The amount of money that's being pumped into militarizing neighborhood policing was already there. And I couldn't disagree more that the Black Lives Matter movement was part of the outgrowth of some sort of black discontent with the Obama presidency. I think that what we have seen was right after Obama was elected, a surge in membership to white supremacist organizations. And these terrorist organizations, unfortunately, are in our militaries, they're on our school boards, they are in our police forces, and they're targeting black people. And so in very much the same way that at the end of the Civil War, during the Reconstruction period, you have the establishment and rise of white supremacist terrorism from the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, I don't see Obama as responsible for the hunting of young black people.
Sorry, Jan, Carol, patiently waiting her turn.
It's interesting what you just said, and also what you said about Obama creating a divisive situation, a divided society, because that is what the left said about George Bush for 8 years, and that is why, Julie Eisenhower and Julie Nixon and Susan Eisenhower formed Republicans for Obama. There was the meltdown starting, and then there was also the Iraq War, which caused a tremendous amount of unhappiness in the U.S. So both those 8 years and this 8 years, an accumulation of division and anger in the electorate has caused the rise of the Tea Party, the rise of Black Lives Matter, and the rise of other I wouldn't say extreme movements, but other movements have risen up, and this is why Trump is so popular.
Okay, I want to jump in. Jan, I cut you off.
Well, I really wanted to say that I didn't use the word responsible. If I were a black person and the first black president came in, I would have hoped that more of my issues would have received some attention other than inciting riots. And in fact, what has happened is the Black Lives Movement has grown out of their sadness, their disappointment, their frustration that they have to fight for themselves, but also have a great disappointment that the president that they thought would be on their side really hasn't been.
Susan, can I ask you to respond to that?
The Black Lives Matter movement has risen up out of the extra-legal killing of Black people. It's risen up out of a disregard for our congressional right to due process.
There have been
or constitutional right to due process.
There have been a lot of Black killings. Why now? You know, there's one thing about being frustrated, dissatisfied, but then when it boils up and comes out, why now?
I think it's, well, I think that it's brilliant that it's happening now. I think that this level of political and social engagement is exactly what's necessary to try to overcome a problem that you're absolutely right in pointing out has plagued this community for far too long.
Well, Carol, I'll just turn to you. I mean, wages in the United States have stagnated for the majority since the Reagan years. And really, the American economy, it's shown some signs of recovery, but it's still sluggish. We're not even back to where we were before 2008. That's, again, not really a success story to write home about, is it?
No, and anything that Obama would have liked to have brought in that might have improved that situation. He was up against a Republican Congress and Senate in the past 3 or 4 years, and it's made it more difficult for him to bring in practically all of the programs. He could have expanded Obamacare. So that is where he's been hamstrung. But yes, one could say he hasn't done enough, because when he came into office, I was saying, oh gosh, we've got another FDR. Look at what Franklin Roosevelt did in the first 100 days of his first term in office, 1933, with the New Deal, with the NRA, with all of the wonderful, the TVA, all these wonderful programs that he brought in. This was a man in a wheelchair, plagued by polio, not a well man, but he managed to get Republicans also. Roosevelt was a brilliant politician. He crossed party lines. And that is also something that Obama has never been able to do, which is to galvanize the other party to vote for some of his programs, which is what Roosevelt did, and that's how Social Security came in the 30s. So it could be a personality flaw.
I mean, Jan, you mentioned that the deficit has gone, the budget deficit has gone up. I mean, again, for Republicans, this must be really quite shocking.
Well, frankly, for Republicans, one of the reasons there's so much anger is that our Congress has actually helped to pass that omnibus bill. They've given Obama what he's wanted, and that really is why the Republican electorate is furious with him. And now Obama has just asked for an 18% rise in monies that are given to ex-presidents. So when he leaves office, an 18% rise he's asked for. But, you know, the thing is that I'm not sure that Obama had much of a domestic policy except for Obamacare. And for the first 2 years of his administration, he had a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate. He could have pushed through anything he wanted. And all he did was Obamacare, and then he started fights.
And there hasn't really been a New Deal, as Carol said, Season, but I mean, the living standards stagnation is something that's really hitting home, isn't it, in the United States at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that is a major cause for people to, you know, rightly want to kind of shake up the establishment. The whole kind of deindustrialization process that's been happening over the past kind of quarter century is really leaving people destitute.
And if I may add one small thing, which is the discontent in the African-American community, to me, which was most powerful, happened during the Bush era, during Hurricane Katrina, when the symbolic event was Condoleezza Rice buying $350 shoes in New York while people were drowning and stranded in Louisiana. And that really was a seminal moment, because even Fox News was attacking Bush at that time.
Now, people have been discussing the situation. We can't really stay off the current US presidential election. And looking at this election, what, Jan, is fueling support for Donald Trump?
Well, what's fueling support for Donald Trump is very similar to what is fueling support for Bernie Sanders. The electorate, both sides, are very disappointed in the current state of affairs. They are upset with Obama, and they are also, we put the Republicans in the House and in the Senate in a majority in 2014, and they have done nothing. Nothing but give in to Obama. So that is a lot of what is causing the rise. I think people are upset with outsiders. They are with the establishment. They want someone who they really believe is going to make a change.
That's why Sanders is popular.
We'll come on to Bernie Sanders in a minute, but I mean, are you worried about the rise of Donald Trump this season?
Absolutely. I think that someone with such blatant disregard for the Constitution running for the White House is a huge cause for concern.
Carol, what's fueling support for Donald Trump?
Well, we haven't talked about the white, blue-collar, huge electorate. Well, I wouldn't say white Anglo-Saxon Protestants because they're not all of that ilk, of that background. It's a variety of people who feel disaffected, who feel that all of the mainstream Republicans do not represent them. And here is a guy who's a billionaire. He's the host of The Apprentice. He's made a fortune. His name is on buildings. And he touches a nerve with people who feel that they are completely unrepresented, even though they voted for Republicans, as Jan said, to take on the Congress and the Senate, the majority. But now they're saying, we're sick of politicians, and as much as people loathe the racist and Islamophobic comments he's made, his popularity is burgeoning.
Now, the Republican elite do not like Trump, do they? They don't really want him as a presidential candidate, Jan.
The establishment actually hates Cruz and is willing to tolerate Trump. But they're both outsiders, and they wanted their own person in there. But you have to think about this is from the standpoint that major donors used to be able to control the campaigns. And right now that's not happening. It is populism.
And Trump doesn't need major donors,
No,
particularly.
he doesn't. But see, that's also what's scaring them, because he has been saying to the people at his rallies, you are my special interest. I will not be beholden to the special interests of K Street, the lobbyists, the drug companies, or any of those, but you people are my special interest, and we need to clean this up.
Susan, I read somewhere that someone argued there's not enough white male voters to get Trump elected. Do you accept that?
I think that there is a specific intersection of people who, for whom Trump's narrative is very compelling. It looks as though the numbers wouldn't bear out a Trump victory over Sanders or Clinton.
Now, let's turn to the Democrats' race. I mean, Bernie Sanders has really sort of made a surprise here. How do you explain the support for Bernie Sanders that we're seeing?
Aren't you lucky to have somebody who had a house in Vermont? Because Bernie was our congressman for 17 years, and then he, to many people's surprise, won a seat in the Senate. He's now 74. He was a wonderful congressman, a great constituency congressman, and also he's been a very successful senator, very imaginative. And he also gets on very well with Republicans and with some people on the right, like Jim Imhoff, who I would call a right-wing member of Congress, and members of the Senate as well. Bernie is very friendly with Jeremy Corbyn, who is the new head. For your viewers who are not familiar with the politics here in Britain of the Labour Party, and definitely on the left. What Sanders represents, in an odd way, is what Trump represents. Disaffected Democrats, young people. In Bernie Sanders' case, young people adore him. You will find that in the states where he wins, 80 to 85% of the voters who voted for him were college students, their first time voting. And he represents anti-establishment, anti-banks, anti-big financial institutions, doesn't like hedge fund managers, doesn't want any kind of relationship with big donors, although people will argue he did support the National Rifle Association, because let's face it, when you live in Vermont or in Canada, nobody will laugh now when I mention this, since The Revenant, you've got to protect yourself. Everyone's going to laugh all over the world watching this against attacks by wild animals.
Season,
in that
this is
part of
very
the world.
interesting because the support for Saunders, the sorts of rallies we're seeing, and indeed for Trump, it's kind of turning the lazy stereotypes that lots of people have in Europe and elsewhere about the United States on their head. I mean, there's a real political involvement here.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that that's really exciting, and I'm hoping that actually one of the legacies of the Obama presidency, or one of the things that will benefit the country going into the next administration, is more involvement by these grassroots organizations, like Black Lives Matter, for example. Some of the leaders of this movement are now seeking seats in local government. So I think that this is really kind of where it all is going to come from people who aren't taking the same things for granted. And who are willing to stand up and be rebellious.
Now, Jan, we're going to talk about Hillary Clinton in a minute, but I've been reading a few articles by people who support Saunders who say if it's Clinton versus Trump, they'd vote Trump. I mean, this is outstanding and unbelievable, is it not?
Well, it isn't unbelievable because when you look at the parallels, they use different language. Okay, he hates big corporation, he hates Wall Street. Trump is willing to attack the hedge funds and the special interests. And it gets down to that group of 67% of the current voting population that is angry and feels betrayed. And they went from a sense of hopelessness, oh, I won't vote, oh, I won't do anything, to this rising anger and feeling betrayed that they are willing to stand up and now take action.
I see you nodding with that, Carol.
Yes, because in the past couple of years, the American electorate, Democrat and Republican, has expressed 23% or 21% approval of Congress and the Senate. The American electorate just doesn't like what it sees going on in Washington.
Now, let's turn to Hillary Clinton. She is the establishment candidate in the Democrats, isn't she, Season?
Yes, yeah, she is. She's the business as usual candidate who takes positions on global trade and then changes them, who has certain relationships with leaders in the Middle East and then changes those. And so, I would say that she's definitely the establishment candidate.
A few skeletons in the closet, perhaps, Jan?
Oh, just a few. We haven't fully investigated the Clinton Foundation and the arrangement that was going there. The young voters, women, do not want to vote for her because where my generation sort of accepted how she killed the bimbos that her husband was spending some time with, when they heard that, they absolutely turned against her.
Yes, an interesting point about Bernie Sanders is, number one, but Abdul Bari Atwan, the journalist who's based here, who does a great deal of broadcasting on the BBC, said that in the Arab and Muslim world, he is greatly loved. Bernie Sanders is loved. He is not a friend to Israel. He will really put a fire under Bibi Netanyahu or whoever, if he is elected, will be the Prime Minister of Israel. And the other thing about Bernie that's so interesting that has come up in the past week is that he is saying already that Obama should appoint a new Supreme Court justice to replace Scalia, who died, with someone who is even more to the left than any of the existing liberal justices, which I find rather interesting.
I mean, there's the legacy of Iraq here, isn't there? It's haunting both parties, the legacy of the 2003 war.
Definitely, definitely. And I think that's another attribute to Trump's rise. He does not want to go in. And when he accused Bush and Cheney of not exactly telling the truth about weapons of mass destruction, this has been something that needed to come out and be discussed amongst the Republicans. And the Democrats had already discussed it. But that really has helped influence because he wants a focus at home.
I'm very sorry, we're out of time now. I hope you enjoyed that debate. I certainly did, and I found it really informative. We'll be bringing our panel back over the coming weeks and months to discuss the progress of this fascinating presidential campaign. This is Chris Banbury, thanking you for joining us. Goodbye.